Hello and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today we are joined by Gautam Bhatia. Gautam is coordinating editor of the Hugo Award-winning magazine Strange Horizons, and he also highlights South Asian speculative fiction on his Substack Words for Worlds. In the 2020s, he has become a novelist in his own right, publishing the anarchist-inspired duology The Chronicles of Sumer to critical acclaim. Gautam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So the first thing we want to talk about is your latest novel, The Sentence, which came out this past October. I believe in India only, is that right?
So far, it's available.
So far.
It's so far been published in South Asia, but I've just signed with a UK-based literary agent last month. So I'm hoping that it's the first step towards having the book available in the world at some point, perhaps next year.
Yeah, so out in India, soon to be published in the West. So my co-host Gordon just read it, actually, and is pretty excited to discuss the book. But before that, could you hit us with your best elevator pitch for the novel?
Yeah, imagine that you have been frozen in cryosleep for 100 years for a crime that you may or may not have committed. And imagine that now someone has to prove your innocence 100 years later.
Yeah, I really thought the premise of the book was really compelling. I really liked the book. The city the novel takes place is basically split half and half in like a technocratic capitalist society and anarchist commune. There's sort of like this truce that was arrived at 100 years ago after this assassination that started everything off. And then the main thrust of the novel is the person who did this assassination, who may or may not have actually done it, is in cryosleep and is being defended by our main character for trial. Something I was wondering is, you're a lawyer, and yeah, that definitely comes through in the book. Most of the characters are, I guess, at least this world's equivalent of lawyers, guardians, and the book is all a lead up to a trial. I thought that was really refreshing because I feel like reading speculative fiction, a lot of the times the law kind of gets put on the back burner, used just like a plot device, and doesn't feel particularly coherent. So yeah, I was wondering if that's something you would like to see more of, law and speculative fiction and stuff, and yeah, just being a lawyer in general, how that affects your work.
Yeah, I think so, because of course, speculative fiction and science fiction in particular, you have your set piece trials. Star Trek, has a famous trial scene. Is data, does data have rights? Can data be, dismantled without, their consent? So you have some classic set piece trials in science fiction, but they're highly stylized. They show you only the most glamorous and the last bit, which is the rhetoric, soaring rhetoric in the courtroom, and they don't really get to grips with the way law and legal systems constitute the unseen plumbing of society. So I think that in that sense there is space for science fiction engaging with law in interesting ways. You do have some writers doing it. Max Gladstone, has done it, and Robert Jackson Bennett's latest book has engagement with law, so it does exist. But yeah, I think we do. It would be good to see more of it. And of course, my day job influences or has influenced this book specifically, because many of the debates that I engage with in this book, in particular, this idea of, if you are representing an individual, to what extent you become associated with that individual's cause or what they've done, and to what extent can you detach yourself from the ethics and the morality of what they've done. In our world, there is often a very straightforward answer, which is that there is no connection. You are just doing your job. But I think it's always been a lot more complex than that. And I try to get at a few of those issues in the book that really flow from things that are experienced, on a day-to-day basis in the courtroom.
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoyed that the main character, most of the action and even the climax of the book is all around just her talking to people, gathering evidence. It's not just the trial as the main thing, and that's why it's law fiction. And it's sort of like set some rules of engagement. The main character wasn't gonna go around and just start killing people. Like she still just, even though it was a very important case and they were very influential, it wasn't gonna. She was still doing her job the whole time to some extent. One thing that came up a lot was, you were sort of mentioning with the consequences of representing someone and how attached you are to the cause, is sort of this juxtaposition between the main character is like first hired for the case because she has this this sort of public motto type thing, which was "Let justice be done, though the world burn," which is a very, I don't know, almost feels like it could be a Kant quote or something. Very don't care about the consequences. You have to do what is right in the moment. But then there's also this idea of moral luck that keeps coming back, which is involving that the morality of what you do might be determined by your consequences, by the consequences of the actions, right? And you could get lucky there or unlucky, just depending on what happens. And I guess moral luck kind of just feels intrinsically wrong, but it does feel very tied up into law. Like, murder is a different crime than attempted murder. If I was driving my car and fell asleep for a few seconds, it's a very different situation if I hit someone in those few seconds, even if I had the same actions. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and particularly like whether moral luck should be in place in the legal system. Would an ideal legal system not have that? Or
Yeah, so the term moral luck was basically first coined in 1976 in a debate between two philosophers in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams. So, they had this debate over moral luck. But actually, it tracks a much older debate, which is the distinction between the Greek idea of tragedy and then the Shakespearean idea of tragedy, where in the Greek idea of tragedy, you as an individual can have the best of intentions, can do nothing wrong from your side, and still end up committing a morally horrendous act. The classic example is Oedipus, who from his side doesn't intend to do anything wrong, is not motivated by the will of doing something wrong, is always in fact doing what at that point would appear to be the right thing, and still ends up murdering his father and then, sleeping with his mother, right? Which in the context of that play is pretty much the worst crime you can commit. So in that sense, Oedipus gets morally unlucky. He's not a bad person. It's just that he's morally unlucky. Whereas when you get to the Renaissance and to Shakespeare, the idea there is that tragedy, flows from the fatal flaw, right? In the individual, there is some flaw in you, and it's you intend something, and that's what happens. I've always been fascinated just by that distinction and these two different ideas of when we end up in a tragic situation. Like you said, moral luck is shot through, in the law, right? But in a more complex way. So both attempted murder and murder are punishable. They're both crimes. And so in that sense, when it comes to criminal character or the unlawful character of an act, there it doesn't matter if you succeeded or not, got lucky or not, but it does matter when it comes to the sentence. So you punish murder more severely than attempted murder. So there, the quality of the act, or the gravity or the seriousness or the degree of punishment seems to then track your luck or lack thereof. So what is going on there? Again, criminologists have a long-standing debate over the role that moral luck plays in criminal law, and it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. So that it is basically it just depends on the extent to which you think something like intention determines the moral quality of an act.
Yeah, I didn't know that about the Greek versus Shakespearean tragedy, but that's really interesting. Makes a lot of sense. One other thing I thought was interesting about the book was Jagat, the potential assassin who's in cryostasis. He's this really interesting figure where he's more of like a symbol for a movement than an actual person. No one knows anything about his life, but he's sort of the most honored person and a hero to this anarchist commune because it's an anarchist society. He's not supposed to be an important person. He's kind of supposed to just represent the everyman of the time. And so the idea of just like treating him as more of a person than a symbol for a movement, I thought was really interesting. I was wondering if he had any inspiration from someone in the real world. I was trying to think of like who could be someone that could have been a person in cryostasis now that could have caused a similar type of impact. And yeah, I was just wondering if you had any inspiration there.
No, not specifically an individual who would play that role. Although, of course, you can think of many people. Suppose that you froze them. I mean, any of those famous assassins from history, right? The person who shot JFK or Abraham Lincoln or something. You can think of the impact that might have on present day debates. Jagat, who is the alleged assassin who is in cryosleep, was not based on a real person, but it is based on this idea that societies need both martyrs and villains, and both the figure of the martyr and the figure of the villain become the glue that holds society together. So in this novel, for the commune, Jagat is a martyr and he is holding them together. His act, which then led to the revolution through which the commune was born, makes him effectively a founding figure. And every society needs that founding figure, whether it's Romulus for Rome or, George Washington and the founders for the US or whatever, right? But also equally, a villain or an assassin or a murderer can also give a group meaning. So for the north side of the city, that was the act which basically lost them half of their city. And so for them, he is the villain of the piece, and that is equally important. And as the characters discuss in the novel, if you were to bring him back, he probably will disappoint you, right? Because
Yeah.
you've built him up 100 years as either this great founder or this villain. And perhaps, if he comes back, you'll find that he's neither quite one or the other. And what would that mean? Right? So all of those things come into the novel at various points.
So, speaking of anarchism, I think there are some pretty clear parallels between the society of your novel and the worlds of Anaris and Uras in Ursula K. Le Guin's anarchist classic, The Dispossessed.
Yeah.
Now, The Dispossessed came out quite a long time ago, I think almost 50 years at this point.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how do you think The Dispossessed has aged in those 50 years? And how did that inform the creation of the society in your novel?
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question. So obviously, The Dispossessed is the major source of inspiration for this novel. So I think in some respects it's aged well, and in some respects it's aged quite badly. I think one of the ways in which it has aged badly is the gender roles in capitalist Uras are too simplistic. Gender discrimination has evolved into much more insidious and in much more subtle ways. Whereas in Le Guin's novel, it's still a very crude kind of 1930s gender inequality. I think that the ways in which it has aged well are the depictions of Anaris. Just the way in which Le Guin looks at how you would organize anarchism, the way it would impact the urban landscape, the ways buildings would reflect that society's ideology, and where you would find the sources of motivation once you've abolished the capitalist sources of motivation. In those respects, it still feels fresh and new and interesting.
I think one thing that feels both fresh and dated about The Dispossessed is that there is just this austerity to it all that I think is increasingly absent from leftist imaginings of the future. I think that as material standards have increased and as people have had access to more and more goods in the West and the global North, people have found it harder and harder to imagine a society where they can't just have it all. And I think that it's really striking that Anaris is quite just and equitable in the grand scheme of things, but there is also material hardship that they have to adopt as a consequence. And I think that something I really like about The Dispossessed is I think it makes a pretty strong case for social democracy. You go to Uras and it's not just this total hell world. It's actually a pretty nice place to live. And I can certainly imagine a lot of people reading it and just being like, hey, I mean, Uras, it doesn't sound that bad. It sounds a good amount better than the world we live in. I wouldn't be surprised if some people read the book and they took away, I would prefer Uras actually. And I think it was pretty courageous for Le Guin to make a point like that, because it's harder for me to imagine people writing in such a way today.
Yeah, I think that's correct, because I think a lot of modern science fiction that is in the same ballpark is post-scarcity, right? Star Trek gives you a post-scarcity utopia, the replicator, all of that, right? So you basically solve the problem of scarcity. So then you can afford to be a communist society, right? So once you solve for that, then what's left. And similarly, Ian M. Banks's Culture series, which I love that series, the same thing, right? So it's a post-scarcity utopia. The minds have taken over; they will handle everything, and human beings can just live in comfort. And a lot of solar punk, I think, is again along those lines. Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot series, which I enjoyed reading. I wrote a review of the first one for Strange Horizons, but I just feel that it's a little too easy. You can't get to that non-hierarchical egalitarian society without sacrifice, and a continuing kind of sacrifice. So for me, the Le Guin vision is actually much more convincing, because I think if you're going to have an equal anarchist society, you will have to accept a decline of your living standards, which is something I think that modern left-wing philosophy, which is not fiction, but philosophy generally tends to agree on, unless you're going into that luxury communism thing, which again I find quite unconvincing. And that's sort of the real choice, right? So are you willing to give up many of the comforts of modern day life in order to achieve a more just society?
I also feel like if you just have a post-scarcity society, your political and economic system just kind of matters less, I guess. If everyone in your society is happy and wealthy and living a good life and comfort, it's that's kind of the goal of whatever your political system is. Once you imagine different systems and they're all like that for some technological reason or something, it's just it feels less impactful.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit. So I was reading your interview with Vector magazine, and one of the things that you talked about is how when you're like a South Asian author, there's this expectation that you're gonna set your stories in this sort of like idyllic, timeless, exotic, generic South Asia with all these gods and goddesses. And you're talking about how this can be kind of frustrating if you don't want to write something like that. And I do think that in the modern push for diversity, I think there really is a lot of focus on aesthetics. Like, oh, are people like speaking a different language? Are they eating different food? Are they doing these other things? Which I think is obviously important, but I think should be maybe in less of a focus in something like speculative fiction, where the focus is really on the ideas and ideological diversity. So I just wanted to ask, for the benefit of our Western audience, are there any speculative ideas that stand out to you as being particularly South Asian? Like they're sort of difficult to encounter outside of a South Asian context? And also, are there any Western speculative ideas that feel natural to us in the West, but in South Asia, people might be like, huh, I've never really thought about imagining that before.
So I was writing a long-form review of Sri Lankan SF for the Himal magazine, which is specializing in the geographical entity that is South Asia. And I think the interesting thing that I noticed, and this is perhaps something that connects the South Asian experience, perhaps also more in the global South, is the micro-violence of the bureaucracy, or the outsourcing of micro-violence to a bureaucracy that I didn't notice when I was living in the West. But you notice it every single day in India or in Sri Lanka, right? It's just the way that the administration and the bureaucracy exact violence upon defenseless people, not in the sense of genocide or large scale violence, but just micro physical violence, micro other kinds of violence, imprisonment for a short time, and then you're out, you're back in. Yeah, so there's like a range of things that happen, a kind of micro-violence that perhaps is not so much there in the West. I think he did that very well, Vajra, in that book. And I think that perhaps might be something that you'd find in South Asian science fiction that perhaps you wouldn't find so much in Western SF. But I think it's also worth remembering, and this is a point I made a lot when I was speaking after The Wall came out, which is that those of us who are writing in English and whose books actually come into these spaces, our childhoods and teenage years, therefore, the kinds of cultural signposts that we inhabit are not representative at all of the vast majority of the countries we live in. This is a little joke that New Delhi is closer to London than it is to the neighboring village in India. So someone who is actually like me, who grew up in a home with academics where English was actually the first language in the heart of South Delhi, which is the national capital. My first bookshop, my parents got me Asimov's Foundation and Tolkien's Hobbit. So in that way, what we have grown upon is actually much, much closer to what Western writers and readers would have grown upon than our own compatriots in our countries. So I think in that sense, you'll ultimately find very similar themes, which is also actually why it is so annoying for me when there is this insistence that there must be some depiction of India that is in some way recognizable to people in the West in this idle, aimless, thing of gods, goddesses, and so on. Because actually, the books that shaped me was the Star Wars books that were there after the series, and Le Guin and Asimov and Clark, and that's sort of where my SF is coming from. Of course, it's informed by my context, so it's rooted in the country I live in, but a lot of it actually comes from those books. That's true for pretty much every SF novel you will read written by an Indian or a Sri Lankan or a Bangladeshi, Saad Hussain, right? His novels, which will come to you, because otherwise they won't come to you. They won't reach you if that wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering, is how close are these worlds ideologically? I recently read Remembrance of Earth's Past by Cixin Liu, the Three Body Problem trilogy. And one thing that was pretty striking to me about it, after having met a lot more Chinese students during my time in university, is there's this pretty strong focus on one-ness that is through the text that feels very, very Chinese. Like there's a lot of hand-wringing about parts of humanity splitting off. And I still don't really get it. I can't say that I do, but Chinese people were essentially able to convey to me that there is something about this oneness that is much more important and visceral in China than in the US. And sort of how this came up is because of the Taiwan issue. It was hard for me to understand like why people cared so much about this. And I think it was just a cultural idea that is hard to transmit. And I felt like I got more out of the Three Body Problem, because I read the first book in high school, but I think reading the rest of the books after college, I was better equipped to understand the text after just being like, oh yeah, this is sort of this idea that is difficult to culturally translate, but is definitely present.
No, so I think it's interesting that you brought up Chinese SF because, of course, it's experienced a big, massive boom, in the last decade. But the interesting thing for me is that science fiction is written in Chinese, right? So what happened in India was that because of the internal diversity, specifically linguistic diversity, they couldn't agree on a national language because if you pick any of those languages, everybody else would be very upset. And so basically, they had to pick English as the official Indian language. So court proceedings, parliament, right, the official language is English. So therefore, obviously, those of us who are born in this sort of upper middle class social stratum, our entire orientation and thinking is in English. And if you read those books about decolonizing the mind, Bhatia, all of that, the language in which you think and you dream plays a big impact on just pretty much everything, right? Your worldview and so on. So I think that, yeah, if you were to get, say, Hindi science fiction novels translated into English, or, well, I mean, there's not a strong Hindi tradition. So say in Bengali, right? Bengali has a strong tradition of science fiction for 100 years, right? So if you were to get translated Bengali science fiction or translated Tamil science fiction, you would then perhaps see something distinctive, something that is not immediately relatable because it comes from a certain rootedness in a certain cultural milieu that is strange to you. But if you are reading an Indian science fiction novel written in English originally by a writer who is comfortable enough to write directly in English, it's not going to exhibit that kind of cultural signifier because, in fact, the person who has written it has come from this kind of very, very hybrid childhood and teenage years where actually their influences are just all over the place and a lot of it are English language influences. So that's going to be inevitable.
This does really provide two paths forward for different geographic and cultural regions of the world entering science fiction. Like, science fiction has exploded in China so much that honestly, their magazines and stuff might be more influential from a numerical perspective than the United States. And so there's really not as much of an incentive for them to drift towards the mainstream. And they just have their parallel institutions. Whereas on the other hand, I think that in Europe, and like you were saying, perhaps even more so in India, people are just drawn to the Western American and British centers of gravity. So I was wondering, like, what do you think is the ideal balance? Like, what properties do you think would be ideal for like a flourishing of parallel science fiction cultures?
I think the really important thing, and I was reading this in a book recently, is to avoid having writers stand in for their cultures. So when I'm writing a science fiction novel, I'm not representing India. I am not representing anyone. I am just writing a good story and let the story be judged on that marker. Like, is it a good story? Was it interesting? In Strange Horizons, a few years ago, I had a Palestinian science fiction special issue. And in the editorial, one point the editors made who were Palestinian was that it's not that a Palestinian has to write about Palestine. They may just want to write about Deep Space Nine and they should have the freedom to do that. So it shouldn't be that the ability to write universally and using universal themes is a preserve of Western writers. Whereas if a non-Western writer writing it, it has to be, in effect, a representation of a culture.
I've noticed that when it comes to mainstream science fiction institutions, there's a surprising amount of space between them and what I would consider to be the largest groups of science fiction fans. For example, Worldcon and the Hugo Awards are going to be in Seattle this year. And there are a lot of science fiction fans in Seattle. I might even go so far as to say that most people I meet are at least somewhat a fan of science fiction. But I've talked to almost no one who actually knows that it's happening. Do you think this is by design, or do you think this more speaks to a failure of sci-fi's main institutions to really reach their readers where they're at? And do you think that the split was always existing, or do you think it's kind of like a novel consequence of science fiction just becoming like wildly more popular?
I think what you just said, I think it's more that because Worldcon being an insular place, it goes back. It was basically always a gathering of geeks. Worldcon was never designed as a public-facing institution. It was always for the geeks to like gather around and spend time with their favorite writers and so on and so forth. Of course, the world has changed and science fiction has changed and it's become a lot more mainstream than it was. But Worldcon hasn't changed, right? So I think that's the real issue because Worldcon still feels like us geeks who are the writers and the readers and the fans of a certain persuasion. This is for us. It's a little conclave for us to have fun for 3 or 4 days and then disperse to our respective places. But again, interestingly, the year that Worldcon was in Chengdu last year, which was highly controversial for various reasons, but I remember that actually they turned Chengdu into an SF city. Like the metro had seats designed for Worldcon. They built a whole new convention center, and they basically, they turned Chengdu into a science fiction city for the duration of Worldcon. So that would be, public facing work. And of course, again, in China, science fiction is at least partially a state enterprise, right? So for the Chinese state, it is an element of Chinese soft power. So, I'm not saying that you should imitate that kind of model, but I do think that there is a disconnect between Worldcon, the nebulas, and so on, and the larger casual readership of science fiction.
So where do you stand on the insularity of things like Worldcon? Like, are there specific ways that you would like to see it engage more with the general public?
I think so. I think so. I think it should. Again, I remember Chengdu Worldcon. I think they had like school trips and so on. There's just a lot of scope to really use the opportunity to popularize science fiction as a genre in those days. And I think like starting with cutting the ridiculous fees would be a good start. Because it's crazy expensive. Not just transport, but the attendance fee is crazy expensive. So you cut that. That would be a good start, I think.
One thing that I would really like to see from Worldcon is I think it would be cool to see them engage with more of the world of web fiction. I'm sort of not really convinced one way or the other as to whether Worldcon should be a more open enterprise. Like, I think there is some value in keeping it insular in the way that it is, because you can't undo it, right? You open up and you can't really go back to what you were. But I think in a lot of ways, like, web fiction is the new pulp. And I think that a lot of the discussions around web fiction that I see on the internet in those corners would be really well suited for an environment like Worldcon. I think it would be cool to see more digital fiction making its way into the space. How do you feel about that?
I would agree. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's an unexplored space. I wouldn't say I'm a massive web novel reader, but I've read enough to know that it's really good. And I think actually there would be an overlap between fan fiction and web novels, right? So not directly, but to an extent there is some overlap in terms of how they begin and so on. So I think I would be interested in seeing more of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge overlap with fan fiction, I would say. I mean, I think especially in things that aren't web novels, but kind of like more unusual storytelling styles as well. Speaking of fan fiction, you used to write an interesting style of fan fiction on dragonmount.com.
Ah, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience there?
Pretty much every science fiction writer I know has begun their life writing fan fiction. This is way back. This is 2004 when Robert Jordan was still alive and when The Wheel of Time was still in progress, the novel series. I was in Manchester in the UK and just picked up The Eye of the World. As I was a teenager, I picked up The Eye of the World for £1 at a garage sale. And I loved the book and I went online and I found dragonmount.com. And dragonmount.com had this really interesting style of fan fiction where they called it role playing, not the MMORPG role playing, but role playing writing. You would create your own character within the categories of Wheel of Time characters, write yourself a backstory, not have you being like the chosen one or anything of that kind, like a normal backstory. And then, depending on what character you were, you would then be part of this co-writing project. So I was, for example, a warder. You get to the White Tower, you are bonded to an Aes Sedai, and you have adventures, right? And all of that would take place through co-writing. So say someone would advertise on the forums looking for 2 warders and 3 Aes Sedai for an adventure in the Isle Waste. And then you would sign up. And then the person who posted the call would begin writing the story. They would write one scene. And then you would continue with the next scene. And then the next and the next. So basically like a chain novel, right? Imagine it being a chain novel where 5 different people are writing every chapter successively. So person A writes chapter 1, person B writes chapter 2, and so on. And that was excellent for teaching you discipline because you can't ruin it for everybody else, right? So you have to write a consistent, coherent story and really good for character development because you can't then have Mary Sue's, you can't have characters that are super powerful. It trained you very early on to write in a way that was disciplined and good. And it was great fun. I'd write my bit and then wait impatiently for my turn to come next. I made good friends, I think it's still going on actually.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, Dragonmount exists still. I mean, I know it does. The Wheel of Time community exists. So I think also this is still going on as well. So I think if anyone's out there who's listening and who is at the point where they want to start off writing, this is actually a great way to train yourself in community, actually. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does actually sound really enticing.
It was addictive after a point, and I was in high school and had exams, and I was just busy writing, on dragonmount.com, engaging with Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time fandom. It was incredible, like best days of one's life.
So was this mostly like an anonymous affair, like all business, or I'm pretty curious, like what the sorts of relationships you make through this activity would be. Like, was there like a parasocial element to it? Did you have favorite writers that you became able to actually know?
Yeah, I mean, I think like any social group, you had your superstars, right? And you wanted to be noticed by them and co-write with them, and we had chat forums. Yeah, you had your glamour people there, and you were starstruck, and yeah, it was very much the case.
So, who would you say was the most sought after Wheel of Time fan fiction account handle?
There was oh my God, it's been 21 years. There was someone called Sirayan Sadai, who in fact was frequently on the chat forums as well, was very popular. And I think she went into publishing, fittingly enough.
Oh
Of
wow.
course, you lose track. After a point, you don't know where they went, because also you don't know what their real names were. You don't know who they are in real life. A lot of us actually both wrote on Dragonmount and wrote on LiveJournal. So there was that strange overlap as well, where LiveJournal would be slightly more personal, whereas Dragonmount was all internal world building, right? So there was that as well. It was a fascinating set of people to engage with. There were a couple of others, but yeah, the names are now slipping my memory because 2 decades is a very long time to remember what were basically pen names.
How much would you say financial constraints play a role in the operations of a magazine like Strange Horizons? Like, is it sort of just like difficult to survive in 2025 as an online magazine, or do you kind of have this like core of supporters that you can rely on and basically have the freedom to pursue the projects you want?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been lucky so far in that this is our 25th year and our income is purely outsourced. And so what we do is we have a Patreon and we have a Ko-fi and we do an annual fund drive. And the bulk of next year's funding comes from the fund drive. And to attract people, we have gifts which the writers donate. So writers often donate signed copies, first editions. Sophia Samatar, for example, donated her novella this time and other such rewards. We say that, okay, if we cross this goal of funding, we'll have a special issue, for instance, this year on Afro surrealist science fiction. So there are a range of things we do that tries to drive interest. And so far, we have made our funding goals fairly comfortably. Normally, we have something like a base goal on Kickstarter of around $15,000, followed by all these stretch goals. Normally, we end up around $21,000 is what we get normally. But I've been told that this year, our base goal will now go up to around 24,000 or so. And so far, we've been obviously making it because 15,000 is our base goal, and then it's all above that, right? So we are hoping that if the base goal is around $24,000, we'll still get there because it's basically people will be then donating to keep the magazine running and not for stretch goals. So that's the hope, but it is difficult. And many magazines have shut down for lack of funding. Many magazines dependent upon the crowdsourcing model specifically have had to shut down because of a lack of funding. I think on the science fiction encyclopedia page for Strange Horizons, it says that from 2000 when we began, we are the last surviving magazine that used this model. Of course, there are new ones. So I think, yeah, there's always a sense of precarity around. I think, that will this be the year that you will not be able to raise money? And of course, yeah, we don't have grants and stuff. So there's no like sustaining source in that way. So there is precarity, but so far it is still there. While there is a market for science fiction long form and novels become bestsellers, there is a very, very small readership of short science fiction. So whether it's Uncanny or Strange Horizons or Apex, whatever, the readership of short science fiction is tiny. I think it's pretty much writers reading other writers. Strange Horizons, of course, does short stories. It does science fiction poetry. It does science fiction criticism reviews, and it does non-fiction, so articles and essays. And the readership of poetry reviews and non-fiction is even smaller than the readership of fiction.
Are there any like pieces of speculative fiction criticism that you found to be like especially cool or insightful, or places you go to get that?
Strange Horizons is the place which is, I think, really hardcore on that. We have a full department devoted to that. In fact, last week's issue was our special issue on criticism. So the final Monday of January is our special issue on criticism, and it's very good. So I would recommend that. A couple of years ago, I commissioned and edited a special issue on extractivism in science fiction. I think that had some really good essays. So I think like pretty much Strange Horizons is the main place where you would go for focused criticism and reviewing. Neil Harrison, who was formerly editor-in-chief of Strange Horizons, has begun an imprint called Briardane Books, where they bring out one book a year, and that book will be one critic's career-long critical pieces. The first book was Neil Harrison's own book, and then earlier this year, they brought out Abigail Nussbaum's book called Track Changes. If you're interested in science fiction criticism, then now you have these books that will bring together prominent critics' entire life's work in one place.
Yeah, I definitely have to check that out. Is there any piece of your own criticism that you're especially proud of?
Yeah, so the pieces I wrote about Marlon James's novels, they were my favorite pieces. So in the first novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and then the second novel, Moon Witch, Spider King, came out. I mean, I was really struck by what Marlon James was doing in terms of very subtly taking some of the conceits of the genre and dismantling them. So I wrote 3,000 words each on those two books. Other than that, I've written two long form pieces on contemporary Indian SF and contemporary Sri Lankan SF. So I like those as well.
I think it's a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, do you have anything you would like to plug and or a science fiction short story that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the plug goes, yeah, just my novel, The Sentence, which you can still get it on the Indian Amazon. And in fact, there is a bookshop in Delhi called Midland, the Midland Bookshop, that it delivers abroad. So if you're really interested, you can still get the book before it becomes available in the US and the UK. My favorite SF short story, well, okay, so my favorite writer is Alastair Reynolds. He has this brilliant short story called The Thousandth Night, so I would recommend that. But from a non-big name writer, there was one short story published in Strain Horizons 2 or 3 years ago by a Nigerian writer. It's called Rat and Finch Are Friends, and I would recommend that.
All right, sounds great. Thanks for joining us on the show, and we'll see you all next week.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, so I was pretty apprehensive going to this episode, considering that Gautam's by far the most famous person that we've had on. And we hadn't spoken to him before. And also, I was feeling pretty sick at the time of the episode. So remember, for like the 2 days previous, I was just going through a lot of his old interviews and trying to, I guess, familiarize myself with his material to a level where I didn't feel like I would be super nervous. Because I was very tired, it was 7:30 a.m. for me, and because I was sick, at the end of the episode, I was just kind of cranky, and I was just like, man, that could have gone better. But I think after going through the episode, it was pretty good. I think it had some really good moments, especially in the book discussion. I think it's almost certainly the best discussion of a single work that we've had. Props to you for coming up with the good questions. But yeah, I don't know. What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it was definitely fun to be able to read a book. Like, I read the whole book the day, or at least 90% of it, the previous day, and then directly able to talk to the author the next morning. Was pretty cool. And we really haven't been able to do that. I mean, we read a short story for the Rashida episode, but in general, we haven't really done that before. And yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. For the rest of the episode, I was sort of flying blind because we did opposite things, where I read, just this particular book, but knew pretty much nothing else about him outside of being a Strange Horizons editor. But yeah, I think it went pretty well.
Was there anything about the sentence that you wanted to ask that we didn't really get to talk about?
I think I covered all the main things I wanted to talk about. Yeah, we talked about it. Oh, I guess maybe I'll ask you this question, which I asked Gautam, but I don't think there was like a super clear answer there. But do you think there's anyone in our society currently who, like, if revived and treated more like a person rather than a figure or something, would be like really disruptive to the vision of the public or something about, or like how people think about the world?
Do you mean specifically like an assassin type figure or just anyone?
Not even necessarily an assassin type figure. Just like someone who gets treated more of a symbol than a person, and as a result is like, if they kind of like gained a voice of some sort, would be like pretty, I don't know, impactful.
I feel like someone that would be sort of disruptive is MLK. I think it's really hard for me to imagine a 21st century where MLK is just like alive, even though that's what would have happened if he wasn't assassinated. Probably. Like, he'd be just very old, right? But he just hangs like a ghost over so much of our discourse, and like so much of the stuff is framed as like, oh, is this what MLK would have wanted? Because he died, his worldview and stuff was able to crystallize in a way that other people weren't. But I feel like even John Lewis, who was very minor compared to MLK, like still an important figure, but not even close to MLK's level of stature. Even John Lewis was treated with like a degree of reverence that was not really present for any other lawmaker that I can think of. And I feel like MLK, if he were to come back today and people weren't able to kind of like launder his reputation over time, he kind of just like say some shit and people would listen. I think there was a Boondocks episode about it.
Yeah. I think that's a really good answer, because a lot of things get attached to MLK. I mean, I feel like pretty much at this point, like almost everyone in politics claims to be like a, descendant of MLK in terms of like what their vision is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying MLK wasn't good, but like MLK glazing in elementary school was strong, like so much. People are really uncomfortable with the fact that he was sort of a troubled individual. Like when it comes to his fidelity. I mean, of course, is the main thing, but other things as well.
Yeah, I remember like fifth or sixth grade, like learning about MLK's infidelity, and that just like really fucking with me. Just like being like, but he's just like such a good dude. Like, well, like why would he do this? I felt like very betrayed. Yeah. Changing gears here, I wanted to talk about the article you recently wrote, which is about story 17776 and the internet just getting shitty in general. And yeah, I was sort of wondering what your inspirations for this was and any ideas you had that you didn't really get to put in there that you would like to talk about.
So 17776 and the slow cancellation of the future is an article that touches on a lot of ideas I've been thinking about for a very long time. I mean, 17776 came out 8 years ago. It's a long time. It's like two entire colleges. I just remember when I read 1776, it feeling very important. And I would maybe say that about a lot of technological developments that I encountered in the 2010s. Like, I would see some development, like you see the unveiling of the iPhone, and you're just like, wow, this represents a paradigm shift that will just impact our lives for years to come. And in the case of the iPhone, that ended up being very true. In the case of a lot of things, that ended up being very true. But I felt like the changes that I expected from 17776 never really materialized. And even more disturbingly from that, I kind of forgot that those changes never really materialized. Like, I often forget that 17776 was supposed to have a third part that never came out. But even more than that, I kind of forget that I expected it to create this sea change in media at all. And it reminds me a lot of the work of the sociologist Mark Fisher, who I mentioned in the article. And one of his biggest contributions to sociology was this idea of the slow cancellation of the future, which is basically what I described. Like, for whatever reason, as the 20th century ended and the 21st century moved on, it has become harder and harder to think beyond the paradigms that were invented in the first half of the 20th century and before. And a lot of the discussion and art and overall cultural generation that we're having now is just rehashing themes that have already been proposed. And there isn't as much new starting material to work with. And I guess I relate to that. And I don't think there's a very clear explanation for why that is. I know Mark Fisher definitely points to neoliberal capitalism as the culprit, but I feel like a lot of the developments that have precipitated this change, in my opinion, like, for example, infinite scroll, were maybe going to happen whether we were under neoliberalism or not. Probably not under some kind of anarchist utopia, but in line with the sorts of social democracies that Fisher speaks so highly of in like the first half of the 20th century. So it's something that's interested me for a while, and I was excited to finally be able to write about it.
Yeah, speaking on that last point, I also feel like to some extent the 90s feel like a very culturally alive time, like extremely in comparison to now with like the internet coming out. But at the same time, they also feel like extremely like neoliberal capitalisty, maybe more so than today. But yeah, just in general, the main thrust of this idea of the slow cancellation of the future really feels like it rings true to me. It might be overstated by the fact that a lot of this early development got boosted by me being a child and having this kind of positive nostalgia viewing of it all. But I definitely remember smartphones as they came out, right? Like, I remember there not being any smartphones and then them starting to be a thing and becoming like a big thing and that everyone had. And that was like a pretty large like technological shift and like pretty large cultural shift as well. Although I think the cultural shift started to come later on more often. But then like in the last 10 years or so, it's just like, has there been any significant technological improvements? And then culturally, yeah, it's just like looking back to the early 2010s especially. I mean, just use like social media as an example. I feel like the internet was just, things were like cooler. In 2013, for example, like YouTube was pretty cool. Instagram was pretty cool. Twitter, I didn't really use, but from what I can tell, was pretty cool. Even Facebook seemed like reasonably good as well. And then just like 5-6 years later, I don't think any of that was true at that point. I mean, you point to COVID being like a primary culprit in your article, and I do think that's true to some extent, but I also think COVID just kind of sped things up a little bit in terms of putting everyone on the internet. But I do kind of think, yeah, we've just been heading this direction for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that COVID was like the spark necessarily, but I think it was the single largest incident where a really big group of people were kind of forced onto the internet. In the years before that, there were batches of people that were forced onto the internet gradually. But once COVID happens, like, okay, now you all have to be on the internet. And that made the internet just way less cool. The thing where I feel this the most strongly is online dating. I remember I read this article in like 2016, I want to say, where the author was just like glazing online dating, and in particular OkCupid, because being the sort of person that wants to date online was already like this interesting filter, probably a desirable one if you spent a lot of your time on the internet. But now that it's just like the main way, and in some places the only really reliable way, it's just like obviously less good, because collapsing everyone down into this format that is not particularly ideal for accommodating everyone is just not really good for everyone. And I think that's just one specific area where I think less people who don't like the internet were there would just massively improve. Because when people go on the internet that don't want to be there, they bring their own norms with them that just don't really work so well on the internet. The thing that felt most representative of people not wanting to be on the internet but having to be there anyway was this concept of the remote lunch. I remember there were a lot of corporate events when I started working for my current company that were of the flavor of, well, if we were in real life, we would have some sort of team building lunch together. But we can't do that because we're online. And because online is just a worse version of real life, why don't we just hop on a call and then we'll send you an Uber Eats voucher and you can get a lunch and then you can eat your lunch on the call? Isn't that a good idea? I can see why some boomer would think that's a good idea. But for anyone who's spent any reasonable amount of time existing on the internet in pre-COVID times, it's just obviously insane. And like, why would you do this? Going back to your original point, though, I think that part of what made the release of smartphones and new social technology so exciting is that they never really felt like the end point. They felt like a stepping stone towards something that was even cooler. I feel like the iPhone 5 was the last release of a product that really felt like a big shift to me, like smartphone wise.
All the first iPhone jumps I remember being like pretty significant. Yeah, I remember I got an iPod Touch 4 like a year after it came out, and I was like very, very hyped about that. But at the same time, the iPhone 5 like came out then or right after, and I was also like, but it's so much cooler for all these reasons as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when the iPhone 5 came out, we didn't imagine like the peak of social technology just crystallizing as like an even better iPhone 5 with a really good camera. A really, really good camera.
Yeah, it's like I have a phone I got in 2016, and it is now 2025, and I still have the same phone, and it can do all of the same things, and I don't have any FOMO or anything outside of having, like, yeah, a worse camera is like the only noticeable difference.
But I might actually challenge the idea that it's technological progress that has slowed. Like, I think that if you look at Apple products, some of the innovations that have been made in their latest products are like actually like technological marvels. If you really get into the MacBook M1 chip or something like that, it's like very, very cool from a technological perspective. But like, they're not in a way that changes how we relate to each other. I think that's what makes an emerging technology seem important, is when you can really see the ways that it'll change how we live our lives. And when the iPhone came out, it was just so obvious. But with like an M1 Mac, it's like, oh, we have a faster processor. There's more of a disconnect now where it's not immediately obvious how these increasing technological developments are actually going to change the way that we do anything at all.
Yeah, and I would say, like, especially among our generation, the general vibe of technological advance is just like a negative one. You know, every technology is like one step closer to the inevitable apocalypse or something.
This is why having good science fiction is so important. Because if even the people making science fiction can't imagine some alternate paradigm, then who is going to? Like, that's kind of their thing. When I read some of the hottest science fiction, if you compare it to science fiction from the 1950s, it's like way better written. The characters are a lot better. The settings are a lot cooler. But if you look at in terms of what sort of a new perspective it's bringing, from like a purely technological perspective, I very rarely get something that's beyond the scope of like a New York Times op-ed written by some smart technology person. Whereas if you look at the 1950s, they were really imagining stuff that was not really being discussed in mainstream society. And so even though science fiction has evolved in a lot of these positive ways, I don't think it's quite the beacon that it used to be. Part of that is because, as said in the article, technology has really caught up to the science in a lot of ways. Like, a lot of the story of the 21st century is just applied 20th century science. But I feel like socially and artistically, we really have not cut up to technology. And technology just affords us all of these crazy new ways to make art and relate to each other that are completely untapped. And not only are they untapped, but I feel like people aren't even especially excited about the idea of tapping into them. And that just kind of makes me sad.
So yeah, we've talked a bit about the slow cancellation of the future and whatnot, but we haven't really talked about 17776 at all, which is your favorite book and the main thrust of the article here. So in the society of 17776, it's basically a world where if, say, tomorrow everyone stopped dying, you know, were magically healed of all ailments and stuff and just stopped aging, and additionally everyone stopped having children as well. So it's just like the people alive now just continued to be alive forever. And it's just like viewing that society in America 15,000 years later, after culture has stagnated and people just have to figure out more ridiculous things to do with their time to attempt to conquer boredom. Do you think this seems like a good society to live in? Would you prefer this to the current world?
I think that 17776 is a good society to live in under a lot of different frameworks. Certainly, it's a happier one than the one we live in now. That being said, I would say, a much more of a preference for novelty than the average person. Maybe not necessarily novelty on a huge scale. Like, I'm not the sort of person who's just like traveling a lot and trying to have a lot of crazy experiences, but I definitely like to have a lot of variation in my day to day and especially year to year. And I do think it would be a little bit of a hard adjustment as a result. Like, I think to just be dropped down into a society where everyone is just ancient and nothing ever happens would be tough, especially because in the grand scheme of things, I'm still a relatively young guy and there's a lot of formative dynamic experiences that I would still like to have before settling down. Now, I think there's a much different question when it comes to aging into the 17776 society. Like, I think if people just sort of stopped aging today, well, I mean, I'd win the lottery because I'm just like 24, not super old. So not aging would be nice. And I think that gradually watching society kind of grow into stagnation with me growing into it would probably be fine, and I would probably prefer that. But to just kind of be dropped down as this normal 24-year-old into a society where everyone are kind of like these weird, ancient, stagnant beings that have diverged from humanity, I think it'd be really hard and lonely to fit in, and I think it would really fuck with your psyche. I don't know if there would be any way that you could even assimilate at all. I guess I would probably lean towards no for being teleported into the 17776 society, assuming that I get to live a normal sort of long lifespan otherwise. But if it was like living into the 17776 society, that would be almost certainly yes, much stronger than the preference for the other thing.
I think I would probably agree with you. Just like, well, I think I'm pretty indifferent on the teleporting in. I think I'm almost 50-50 on that. But then, yeah, pretty positive about aging into the society now. Yeah, is there anything you would do? Like thinking if you're like, okay, I'm trying to keep having new novel experiences and whatnot, but I'm in this situation that makes that weirdly difficult. Yeah, is there anything you would do?
I mean, that's a pretty hard question. I would probably, to some extent, try to split my identity into multiple people. I think that I would probably try to live one life as like, I don't know, maybe someone who's like into politics, and I'd maybe live one life as someone who's trying to be like a star athlete. At least mix and match the identity that I'm performing in the society to feel a little bit of that novelty. But I don't know. It's hard for me to say.
My first time reading 17776, actually, like, my favorite chapter was probably the one in which it's just this dude that spends all his time in this cave and he plays old kind of, I don't know, 1980s, 1990s arcade games on some handheld video game device and just gets like extremely good at them. Like getting the equivalent of like full clearing Pac-Man or something on just like a bunch of different games and whatnot. And this is kind of what he spends his time doing, just like mastering these different games and whatnot. And there was something about that felt very wise, I guess. He was cooking in some way with this idea. But looking at it analytically, it doesn't really make sense because unless literally everyone has stopped writing books or making games or movies, there's no way you're ever consuming the media of the world faster than it comes out, right? So you're not actually going to ever run out of stuff. But if you react really negatively to stagnation, to just lock yourself in a cave and do nothing and then like come back out occasionally, the world effectively moves a bit faster from your perspective. Like, if every time you interface with the world is like once per month or something, instead of every day, maybe the really glacial pace of cultural change would feel less that way because you would actually like see things changing more than another person. So maybe that's kind of what I'm thinking of in terms of being like that guy was pretty smart. But yeah, any ideas on that?
That makes sense to me. I think it would make you feel like the world is moving faster. It also just sounds horrible. I mean, I feel like I'm pretty content with doing the same thing for a lot of time, but like, gosh, man, limiting your only experiences to playing single player video games seems pretty horrible. I don't know how long I'd be able to take that. I think it would require a certain strength of character that is rare.
Yeah, I mean, and I think to some extent it was like implied this was like a weird dude who kind of liked this. And, you could find your own niche in terms of just like doing something you really like. Maybe it could be listening to every song from like a hyper specific genre of music, or maybe it could be reading every book of like a certain type that came out in this year. Yeah, I think there's also like, yeah, I don't know, some sort of sense of progress that seems possible there that feels like it would be hard to achieve. Sort of a Sisyphean type happiness. You'd have to be able to like set that limitation on yourself in the world of 1776 because you don't have to do that as much in the real world because there are just like real world limitations.
I guess one course of action that I could imagine myself, going back to your original question about how I would choose to live my life. I don't know if you've read the story Zima Blue by Alastair Reynolds, but basically in the story of Zima Blue, the main character paints these like really, really epic paintings of celestial things. You can see them from space. Just like really, really fucking large panels where, in fact, the art is more about the engineering required to build such a piece of art than the art itself. And then he does that for a while and also just has a lot of experiences. Like, he has this super protective suit that lets him survive pretty much all environments. So just like goes inside of a pulsar, has a lot of universe experiences and draws from that from his art. But then eventually he becomes particularly fascinated with this single shade of blue called Zima Blue. And he starts putting it in his paintings. Like for his very first Zima Blue painting, this is like a painting of his artistic career. He has one of his normal big ass planet sized landscapes. And then there's just like this little blue square in the middle of it. People are just like, huh, that is a blue square. Interesting. And then as his career goes on, the blue square just gets bigger and bigger. And then there's just like really big blue squares. And eventually he kind of has this full circle moment that I don't want to spoil that sort of ties up his entire existence into like a little bow. And I guess his life felt like a very, very long life that felt deeply meaningful to me.
This is the one that's like the Love, Death, and Robots episode, right?
Yeah.
That I also haven't seen, but that I know.
Does it make you want to watch it?
Yes. And this also, same conversation has happened before where you've recommended it and it's made me want to watch it, but I never did.
It's like 20 minutes, bro.
So I should, yeah. It does sound pretty cool. I do think there's an extent to which it is kind of hard to predict what people's motivations will become in immortal society. I think you might see some kind of strange things where just like people end up with really weird goals out of life. Like talking about AI alignment or something where like an AI doesn't necessarily have to have a goal that's kind of comprehensible by people in general, and it can just be like really strange and bizarre and random seeming. It feels like in a post-scarcity society where you're immortal and you don't have everyone guiding you towards these same goals, you would get a lot of people who would want really bizarre things out of life for like not clear reasons outside of just like this is kind of what they want. I guess to some extent, I think that's probably the best hope for dynamism in the 17776 society. Like you just get some people who just want some really weird thing to happen and are willing to dedicate ridiculous amounts of their life to make it happen. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. So we'll finish up with Kevin. Do you have a short fiction or short media recommendation for everyone?
This is a pretty off-brand recommendation for me because I don't think I've ever really liked flash fiction before, but I read this flash fiction story recently called After the God Has Moved On by Kate Elliott. And it's this really short story. I mean, I think it's like 2 pages or something in Lightspeed magazine. And it's the scene right after this person has been possessed by an actual god. And like the god is sort of just like stopped possessing them. And the implications that has been like a very long amount of time and like a lot of stuff has occurred like in that time. And all the characters are just sort of like welcoming them back to reality. It was very cool. I was like, huh, okay. I kind of get why people read this genre now.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool premise.
Yeah, it was like, there's just so much to like imagine.
Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Right.